In a digitally connected world where everything is competing for our attention, sound expert Julian Treasure believes we're losing our ability to listen. Julian is an author, entrepreneur, and the founder and chair of the Sound Agency. That's a UK-based firm that advises businesses worldwide on how to use sound to increase sales, influence environments, and improve customer and staff satisfaction. Julian is also one of the world's most sought-after speakers. His speeches have been viewed an estimated 18 million times online. And his TED Talk, How to Speak So That People Want to Listen, is one of the top 50 TED Talks of all time. In addition to his book, Sound Business, Julian's work is published by major media outlets around the world. He joins us now from London to share his thoughts on the importance of speaking and listening effectively in the art of communication. Welcome to Full Frame. Great to have you on the broadcast.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, Mike.
Julian, I've never been more anxious about an introduction because I know this guy's listening to me and he knows whether or not I'm doing it right. Did I pass the test?
That was beautiful. It was a thing of gorgeous beauty.
Okay, phew, I got past that one. You didn't start out as the sound guy or the listening guy. You started out in publishing, didn't you? So talk to me about this transition in your life.
Yeah, so I had 20 years in marketing, running a contract publishing company, what Americans call custom publishing, producing beautiful magazines and understanding how brands like to communicate with customers. But along the way, by night, I was doing something different. I was a musician, I'm a drummer, and I know all the drummer jokes. So I wanted to bring the two halves of me together. When I sold my publishing business back in 2001, I wanted to bring marketing and listening together because I was conscious that the world was a pretty noisy and unpleasant place. And the question was, does that matter? So I did a lot of research, read a huge number of papers and articles, and the answer was, yes, it does matter. Sound affects us profoundly.
You know, Julian, one of the points you make in your TED Talk, and I think it's extraordinarily effective, is you start talking and then there's all these sounds. We have so much clutter out there, and breaking through the cutting through the clutter is extraordinarily difficult. So when you work with these companies, what's your advice to them? How do they do it in an effective manner?
Well, it's just the starting point is to become conscious about the sound that we're creating and the sound that we're consuming. Sound affects human beings in four powerful ways. Physiologically, it changes our breathing, our heart rate, our hormone secretions, even our brain waves. Psychologically, it changes our moods and our emotions. Cognitively, it affects how well we can think. You only have to work or try and work in an office with somebody speaking next to you to know how difficult it is to think when you're listening at the same time. And then behaviorally, sound changes us. It changes what we do, how sociable we are, where we go, where we like to stay in environments. So a lot of this is simply about making environments more pleasant and more appropriate. That's the word we use a lot at the Sound Agency, is appropriate. It's not about silence everywhere. A football game, for example, would be pretty weird if it were completely played in silence. However, there are places where we need quiet. There are places where we need masking sound so that we don't get interrupted. It's about careful, intentional, appropriate sound design.
You mentioned the two words sound design. You've worked with a lot of companies. Talk to me about some of your achievements with sound design and what do you see there?
Well, we've worked for some big brands where we ask the question, how does your brand sound? And that's not a question many brands ask themselves. You know, you say, have you got a brand book? Yes, we have a book. It's that thick. How many pages are about sound? None. And that's almost universally the answer, which is a bit weird when you think about it, because we experience the world in 5 senses, not just 1 sense. So we've written brand sound guidelines for brands as big as Nokia and Honda. We've created sound in spaces, and that has really become I suppose, a speciality for us in the last few years, mainly retail, because that is a quick win. You can see immediately how a retailer would be interested in making good sound. If a retailer makes bad sound, people leave the space earlier than they would, they spend less money, and the retailer loses. Plus, we lose as human beings because we're in a horrible environment. I'll give you an example. There's many retailers play fast-paced pop music in their stores because they think it's jolly and lively. Actually, if you play music at faster than about 80 to 100 beats per minute, which is the speed of the human heart rate at resting, you're speeding people up and they leave faster. So you're actually reducing sales by doing that.
Let me ask you about communication. I've been a broadcast journalist for quite a while. I've seen Ronald Reagan speak and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, all of them pretty effective communicators, but all with a different style in how they deliver their speeches. What is it that makes somebody a truly effective communicator?
Well, in my TED Talk, I talk about 4 things which I think are really important if you're going to communicate in power to somebody. And they spell the word hail, which is easy to remember for anybody, I think. The H stands for honesty. That is just being clear, straight, and absolutely plain in your speaking. The A is authenticity, which is being yourself. And all of the communicators you just mentioned, Mike, I think you could see their personality in what they delivered. They didn't pretend to be other than they were. The I is integrity, which is being your word. If you say it, it happens. And we all know people for whom that is not true, and then their words cease to have power if we just know they say it and it never happens. And the L, surprisingly possibly, is love. Not romantic love, obviously, but just wishing people well. If you're on stage speaking to a group of people and sharing something, it's not about you, it's about them. And really, that is the case in all communication. If we could get that and communicate with well-wishing and generosity, then the power goes up, the charisma goes up, and the effect is far greater.
The 7 deadly sins. You talk about this in one of your TED Talks. Talk to us about that.
Yes, these are habits, I guess. And I'm not saying don't ever do these things, because we all do them to a degree. But the suggestion is, if you get into the habit of doing these things a lot, it makes you hard to listen to. So the first one is gossiping, which I define as speaking ill of somebody who's not present. So not nice things about people who aren't there, but really nasty things. The second is judgmentalism. We all know people who are very, very condemning. I'm not talking about discernment, it's about being condemning of people, and it's pretty hard to listen for a while to somebody who does that. Then you've got complaining. I'm in Britain, as you can see behind me. This is London, it's evening, and behind me there are millions of people right now complaining about all sorts of things. It's kind of a national pastime in my country. It doesn't help, it's kind of viral misery, it just spreads gloom and doom. Then kind of an extension of that is negativity. The example I always give of that is my mother, in her later years, became just totally negative. And I went in one day to see her with a newspaper and said, "Oh, look, it's October the 1st today." And she said, "I know, isn't it dreadful?" When you get that negative about everything, it's pretty hard to listen to somebody. Then you've got excuses. We all know somebody who delivers excuses a lot. We all deliver excuses sometimes. Sometimes it's better just to say, "I'm sorry, this is what I'm going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again," and move on. And then we've got exaggeration. I did a very interesting exercise once, Mike. This is worth trying for anybody watching this. To avoid exaggeration of all kinds, for a day maybe, that is removing every bit of hyperbole from our speech. Very, really amazing, or if you're American, particularly awesome. I always wonder what an American can say when they see a fantastic sunset now, because if a pair of trainers are awesome, what's a sunset? And then finally we have dogma, which is my way or the highway. This is how it is. Confusing opinions with facts. And they are 2 different things. Many people have them collapsed, and it becomes pretty hard to listen to them. So they're all, they're not deadly sins, but they are things which, if we indulge too much in them, they make us pretty hard to listen to.
What about, here's something I want to ask you about, though. I have a friend of mine who's very, very knowledgeable, but I'm going to give you a perfect sentence from him. "Mike, I have to tell you this important piece of information, and I just found out about it yesterday." What about monotone? What about people using their range?
Yeah.
That drives me nuts.
We all have a vocal toolbox, and most people aren't aware they have one, let alone do they ever open it and rummage around. And prosody, which is another word for intonation, is my favorite tool in there. It's the most important part of speaking. Particularly with a Chinese audience. Chinese people know all about pitch and tone because Chinese is a tonal language. And you change the meaning of a word by changing the way you inflect it. Different cultures have different inflections. If you speak to Scandinavians, they all sound a little bit bored and tired. This is very exciting. We're really excited about this. Whereas if you speak to an Italian, they're really all over the place, So it's cultural. It's also personal, and you're right, the word monotone comes from speaking in one tone of voice, as your friend does, and it means boring. So if you want to grab people's attention, work on intonation and prosody, most definitely.
What about listening too? I mean, I see examples of this, especially when I watch interview shows where somebody asks a question, the person doesn't answer it, they don't ask a follow-up, or they may answer it, they're not listening to the answer, and then they ask a follow-up question where the person just answered it. Listening is a real skill, and it seems like it's also something that's missing out there, correct?
Definitely, definitely. I talk in another TED Talk about the fact that we're losing our listening. It's in danger. And I think very much so, from the noise around us, from the amount of inputs that we have going on, from our impatience. You know, we don't want oratory anymore. We want sound bites from politicians. There's a culture of interrupting. I get driven mad by watching or listening to political debate because a politician will get 10 seconds into an answer and then somebody will interrupt them. So they have to give us sound bites in a way. I think it's tragic that there are probably billions of people on this planet who've never had the experience of being properly listened to. You know, when you listen to somebody fully and completely, for the time you're listening, that person is the only thing that matters in the world. Listening is not, you know, yeah, I am listening. No, you're doing something on your phone. Or, yeah, I am listening. No, you're watching TV. Or, yeah, I'm listening. No, you're chopping a carrot. These are activities which take away, and listening is a generous gift. It's an amazing thing, and it is under threat.
What are some things that you would say to make us better listeners? Because this is something you talked about in your TED Talk, which I thought was fantastic. Just going and experiencing your environment for just a few minutes. Most of us don't even do that.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, I talk about 5 ways of improving listening, and the first is silence. Just getting a few minutes of silence or just relative peace in your day resets your ears and helps you to recalibrate. The second is an exercise I call the mixer, where it's about, maybe you go to a cafe or you sit in a park and you say, how many individual sound sources can I hear around me right now? It's like channels on a mixing desk in a recording studio. Then there's savoring, the one you just mentioned, which is actually listening to things around us and just asking the question, is there a hidden choir in this sound? Is there something magical and beautiful that I've just ignored? And the example I usually give here is a kettle. You know, if you put your ear close to the base, not the top of the kettle, as it's boiling, the sound is really interesting. It's rich and varying and so forth. And then we have a slightly more complex one. This is listening positions. Do you know, Mike, most people listen from kind of a concrete bunker. They listen from the same place all the time. I'm not talking about physically. This is a metaphor. So it is possible to change your listening position. For example, you can listen critically, which is how most people listen in business most of the time. Or you can move across to listen empathetically. Critical listening is kind of judging the person and saying, how well are they doing this? Is this relevant to me? Is this interesting? Whereas empathetic listening is going onto their island, feeling their feelings, and leaving them feeling not just heard, but understood. There are many listening positions, and it's fun to play with them. And then finally, there's an acronym that I suggest in human communication, in speaking communication, and that acronym for listening is RASA. It's the Sanskrit word for juice. And it also, in this case, stands for receive, which is about paying attention with your eyes. You know, listening doesn't look like this. In almost every culture in the world, when you're listening, you look at somebody, and that shows them that you're listening. And you can lean forward a little. The A is appreciate. That is making little noises that kind of oil the conversation. Sort of, oh, really? You know. The S is summarize. And that is using the word so. It's a very important word. You know, if you're in a business and you don't have a so person in a meeting, it can be a very long meeting because there's nobody saying, so we've all decided this, now we can move it aside and go on to that. So is a very powerful word. And then the final A is ask questions all the way through and at the end. Rasa, it's a very good way of really making people feel that you've been listening in a conversation.
Quickly, because we're just about out of time, but I know you do workshops on listening, speaking as well. Is there a common thread that you keep coming up against each time?
Lack of consciousness, I would say, yes. I mean, we're doing different workshops now. I'm about to start a workshop for couples in the UK, which is going to be very interesting, working with my partner and looking at communication across the board in couples, which is, you know, a battlefield for many people. Yes, I think lack of consciousness, just thinking that speaking and listening are natural things. You know, we don't teach them in schools. We teach reading and writing, but the speaking and listening skills are left aside. They are skills. They can be taught. They can be improved and developed.
Julian Treasure, thanks so much for taking time and talking to us. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. A pleasure.
When we come back, photos of homeless people are breaking communication barriers and having a far-reaching impact.